Okay, good evening and welcome. I am Takashi Shogumen. I'm a professor of history and head of department in history and art history at the University of Otago. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to this evening's event. This week, the Department of History and Art History has a great pleasure to host Sir Richard Evans, Regius Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Cambridge. This gentleman here, as a James and Jean Davis Prestige Visitor at the University of Otago. Sir Richard is a world authority on modern German history, and he is also well known as a key witness for the Irving trial over the Holocaust denial, which is depicted in the film Denial, which we shall view this evening. It is more urgent than ever for us to think seriously the fundamental issues such as truth and falsehood, freedom of speech, and history and memory in today's world of post-truth and fake news. Now, prior to the film screening, my colleagues at the University of Otago will interview Professor Evans, and I would like to introduce the interviewers. From your right, Professor Barbara Brooks from Department of History and Art History. She is an expert in history of women and medicine. Associate Professor Mark Seymour, he is a historian of modern Italy, again from Department of History and Art History. And Associate Professor Colin Gavagan from the Faculty of Law. He is an expert in criminal, medical, and emerging technology law. So I would like to hand over to Associate Professor Mark Seymour to chair the interview session. So please join me in warmly welcoming Sir Richard and the interviewers.
Thanks very much, Takashi, and thank you all very much for coming. It's very warming to see this many people here and a good sprinkling of our students, so thank you. Not so much an interview, I don't think, as a friendly chat. Could I just ask, though, how many of you have already seen this feature film? Hands up, please. Okay, not a huge number, but not an insignificant number, yes. Richard's seen it about how many times?
Twice.
Twice?
Yes.
Oh, that's not too many. I'll be up with you after today's showing. Just very, very quick, sort of 30-second synopsis. I'm sure you know roughly, but in the late 90s, the British writer David Irving sued an American historian by the name of Deborah Lipstadt for libel in the High Court of London, because she had written that David Irving was a falsifier of history and a Holocaust denier. So the trial took place, and Sir Richard was the key witness, the historical expert, and it's quite extraordinary and almost uncanny for me to have somebody of that who lived through that amazing case right on my left today. So we're going to ask him some questions about the film and his involvement in making it.
Well, I'm going to begin, and the court case was in 2000, am I right?
Yep.
So it's interesting, I think, that it's taken so long for a film to be made, or that a film was made at all. So what were the particular circumstances, you think, that led to the film being made at this point?
Well, there have been several programs about it. I mean, its importance was recognised immediately, and so Channel 4 rushed out, Channel 4 on TV in the UK rushed out an instant documentary which wasn't carefully prepared. All the transcripts of the trial, everything was said, are all available, so you can use those. You can have talking heads and experts. You can use archive footage. And in that first version, I was played by an old man with a white beard, because that's how they thought Cambridge professors were like. Then subsequently, they did BBC Two did a much more considered programme of nearly 2 hours long, but the same format. It was a documentary with actors playing parts from the transcripts, and they phoned me up and asked me, how tall I was and how old, and my hair colour and my weight and so on. And I was played by Michael Kitchen, who you may know from the programme Foyle's War. And in fact, oddly enough, I ran into him. He was sitting in a pavement cafe a couple of months later, so I went up and said, "Are you Michael Kitchen?" And he said, "Yes," thinking it must be some fan of Foyle's War. So I said, "You played me on television." Now, it's not often one of your characters comes up to you. So he said, I hope I played you to your satisfaction." I'd said who I was, and he remembered it. And I said, "Well, you played me far better than I played myself, because you could rehearse it. I only had one shot." So those are the documentaries, but it's a different thing when you're talking about a feature film to go on general release in the cinema. Ridley Scott then bought the rights to the various books, and a screenplay was done by Ronald Harwood, who won an Oscar for his screenplay of The Pianist. But it never reached the cinemas because I think there was too much courtroom drama. And what you need is a figure to identify with. And it's only when Deborah Lipstadt published her own memoirs of the trial, of the case, and the awful experience of being sued for libel as an historian, that eventually it became possible, I think, to make a drama that held together, which you could identify with the central figure. And it takes a long time. So David Hare, who did the screenplay, came and interviewed me about 4 years ago now. And he gathered all the impressions and so on, and now it's on the screen.
And so how do you feel the film, does it play fast and loose with the actual events, or you feel it's a good representation? Or?
On the whole, it's a very good representation. All the courtroom scenes are taken directly and unchanged from the transcript. So the words you hear people say in the courtroom are the actual words said in the courtroom, and that's very important. A lot of the scenes are reconstructed from memories of the scenes. So the scenes that you'll see in the solicitor's office, for example, they are all real. Of course, there are a number of invented scenes to make the thing hang together. Deborah Lipstadt really did go jogging. I'm not sure whether she paused before the statue of Boudica and looked up at it to identify with it, but that's kind of poetic license in the film. On the whole, it's faithful to the spirit of and much of the letter of the action, and it explains it extremely well. So it's, among other things, a very easily digestible piece of teaching on libel law and how it's different in England and from in America. There are one or two places where I think it's not quite right. So it gives the impression at the very beginning, or quite early on, that I and my team were kind of out to get Irving, and that wasn't the case at all. We had no preconceptions. We didn't know his work. It's not academically interesting, and we didn't know what we'd find. And part of the excitement of working on it was actually discovering the depths of the falsification in which he was engaged. And I also feel sorry, as you'll see, for Robert Jan van Pelt, who the scene you see with Robert Jan van Pelt as the expert on Auschwitz in the courtroom is accurately taken from the transcripts, but they didn't show the next 2 days of his testimony where he really did redeem himself, and he's, I think, justifiably a little bit upset about it, but otherwise it's very accurate.
Thank you. So I'm the outsider in the sense that I'm not a historian here, I am a lawyer, and I've also had occasion to act as an expert witness in a court trial, and I just wondered about that, Sir Richard. When I was acting in that capacity, I was acutely aware of the possibility for tension between my role as a kind of nominally objective academic and a fairly partisan advocate for one side in the trial. It's something I had to give a lot of thought to in assuming that role and thinking about how I would reconcile these two roles. Is that something that troubled you, or did you give thought?
Initially, yes, but you are engaged as an expert witness by one side or the other. So the normal expert witness is a pharmacologist, sometimes a pathologist who's engaged by the Crown Prosecution Service and gives evidence. You give evidence of the sort you can't expect the court to know. So it's like the wound was at such an angle and so deep, so such a depth, and therefore the murderer must have been a left-handed man, 6'3", or whatever it is like that. So that was our function. It's rather different when you're doing it as a historian, but there are safeguards. So first of all, you have to swear an oath and sign an affidavit to the court that you are telling the objective truth and not influenced by who is hiring you and who is paid for you. And secondly, you are paid by the hour at a standard rate. There are standard rates for expert witnesses, and you're paid by the hour. So at the end, the solicitors who've engaged you can't turn around and say, we don't like your evidence, we're going to pay you. You've been paid already. So that's a sort of safeguard. And then thirdly, if the side that's engaged you doesn't like your evidence, they can simply not call you to the witness stand, and then the court can't recognize you. Yeah. So you do feel quite confident in being able to tell the truth as you see it. And in fact, I was looking, of course, for any mistakes that Deborah Lipstadt had made, and I only found one very small, minor one, but then it's only 6 pages in a lengthy book. So on the whole, I felt quite confident. And let me just add, too, that this was a civil case. Now, in a civil case, the judgment is made on the balance of probabilities. In a criminal case, you have to prove something beyond all reasonable doubt, and that's where historians feel rather uncomfortable about that. We like the word probably, perhaps a little bit too much. But in a civil case, balance of probabilities, and that's exactly how we reach our judgment. So, slightly to my surprise, if you might say, the legal epistemology and historical epistemology really dovetail quite well. We have the same concept of how you find out facts and how you prove arguments.
Thank you.
It has, however, been quite controversial having historians in the courtroom. And in the States, for example, in 1985, historian Rosalind Rosenberg testified on behalf of Sears Roebuck, who were being sued for discriminatory practices, in that women had not been promoted. And that caused great division in the historical community because she was seen to be denying equal opportunities to women. So, some historians argued that she, in fact, should not have accepted the role. So do you have a view about that?
You can always refuse, of course. And the French historian Henri Rousseau, who works on the French resistance, has consistently refused to appear as an expert witness in the prosecution of very elderly alleged war criminals in France, because he argues that it's a foregone conclusion. He's being asked essentially to help convict them. And if he starts saying, no, it's more complicated and we can't really know and so on, because it's, remember, beyond reasonable doubt, he would then be seen as being on the side of the accused person. So he says it's a game you can't win. And I think I respect that. It's different, as I said, in a civil case. I was asked, I got a bit of a reputation as being an expert witness. I was asked to act in another case. I was phoned up by a solicitor in London. It was another libel case. And I said, can you tell me what it's about? I said, oh, no, it's all far too secret. You've got to come down and see us, and we'll tell you behind closed doors. And so I did. And I got to the office, and there was a long table in front of me with 4 young solicitors and barristers trying to suppress their grins behind it. And there were handcuffs and whips and military uniforms and so on. And it was, in fact, Max Mosley, the head of, some of you may know this case, the head of Formula One, of racing, who was accused by the News of the World of having a Nazi-themed orgy. And, of course, his father was Oswald Mosley, the fascist, and the leading British driver is Lewis Hamilton, who is black. And so he sued the News of the World. And I was being asked to say it was not a Nazi orgy. And I had to watch.
Stasi-themed orgy.
I had to watch the wretched video. Some of it was so boring. I can tell you. And I could say with confidence, the clipboard is not a characteristic SS device. Others have been known to use it, and so on. It was all such a tissue of fabrications on the part of the News of the World. It was quite absurd. Fortunately, the case collapsed because the main witness, one of the prostitutes, had actually filmed it from a concealed miniature camera, concealed as the lawyer said on such clothing as she was wearing. She realised it was no good, and she felt it out. The case collapsed completely, which I was very grateful because that was the day before, due to open the day before I was going to be interviewed for the Regius Professor of History at Cambridge, and I could just see the morning of the interview, the headline say, Cambridge professor says, you know, Nazi wasn't, orgy was okay. Most cases don't come to trial. Most cases collapse or they're settled out of court. And I've been involved in another case where it was settled out of court. And also I agreed to be an expert witness in a criminal prosecution case, but I had to tell the solicitors that they didn't have a case. It was, what they're asking me to do was simply not possible because the evidence was stacked up too much against their client. So you have a lot of room for maneuver there.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, the Jewish community of the UK tried to persuade Deborah Lipstadt to settle out of court, didn't they?
As you'll see in the film, the Jewish community of the UK was very, very nervous about the action and thought that it would portray them as being kind of aggressive and vindictive towards David Irving. That was a concern that I think was perfectly legitimate. It turned out in the end to be unfounded. But you'll see there's a scene in the film that portrays this. And part of the film is a contrast on many levels between the British and the Americans. It plays with the stereotypes, you know, feisty American woman, stiff upper lip Brits, wonderful American defense of free speech, absurd English legal system, and so on.
Yeah. On a related note, though, there's also a bit of a role for Holocaust survivors. And I think that's a very interesting aspect of the film. I grew up, I cut my teeth on social history in the 1980s and 1990s. Everything was about recovering the lost voices of the past, the people who were not part of a top-down view of history, a history from below. And I was very struck in the film by how it shows that it was for legal reasons. The actual victims, the Holocaust survivors, would have been a liability to the case. And I wondered if you could comment on that.
Well, it's not just that. I mean, if you think back, in the end, this has turned out to be the second great trial on the Holocaust. The first was the Eichmann trial in 1961. And in that trial, the prosecution of the major organizer of the Holocaust, the implementation of the Holocaust, large numbers of Holocaust survivors came to the witness stand and told in incredibly moving terms of their experience. That's 1961. That's only just a decade and a half after the end of the war. Now, in the year 2000, it's very different. These are elderly people whose memories may not be very accurate in some small respects. And it was felt by and this is, again, it all appears in the film, it was explained very clearly, that to subject them to being cross-questioned by Irving, who conducted his own case, he did not use a barrister, by a man who clearly doubted, or professed to doubt, that they'd been through the experiences they described, would have been demeaning and upsetting for them, and the team did not want to expose them to that. But there's a much bigger reason, which is, you know, so it was their own good. It wasn't just a legal thing. But the other reason is the legal one. What you have to do in the defense against a libel suit. So the libel suit is somebody says, that's defamatory, you're damaging my reputation, which it certainly did damage Irving's reputation, and it's not true. And what you do is you turn the tables on the accuser. You prove at enormous length that the brief remarks in Deborah Lipstadt's book, 6 pages, about Irving, that went 2,000 pages of expert testimony. You prove as much as you can that what she said was true. So you have to keep the spotlight on the accuser. The accuser becomes the accused. And that is the central tactic that's used in the trial. And this is explained, in fact, the argument between Deborah Lipstadt, who wants to call Holocaust deniers wants to call Holocaust survivors to confront the denier. That the argument is her and the lawyers who say, no, you do that, you take the spotlight off Irving, you put it on them. Deborah wanted to appear herself. No, because that will again take the focus of Irving. It's got to be relentlessly pursuit of Irving. And that's a major thread of the film, and I think that's a very intelligent way of portraying it. And then I think that sort of turning of the tables led to Irving complaining after the first couple of weeks that he was being treated unfairly, and the judge said, no, this is the way it goes. So I think that's a very important part of it.
Colin, did you?
I found that very interesting as a lawyer, and this tactic's one that we see in other contexts as well. You maybe identify one tiny part of the story about which there's doubt and pick at it and start to unravel the whole thing. We see it with climate denials, we see it with anti-vaccination campaigners and whatnot. I was just thinking about that more generally, that in this case, it seems to have worked very well I could enjoy watching the forensic demolition of everything Irving had said. But there's another part of me thinking, and we sometimes hear this argument, that when dealing with people making these kind of really bizarre claims, the best thing to do is just entirely to deprive them of the oxygen of publicity. Now, Irving gave Lipstadt and Penguin no choice in that regard. He brought the case, they had no choice.
Yeah.
But I was just thinking in more general terms, do you kind of have a view on that? Is it better to go after them and prove them wrong?
Well,
or just
yes.
to marginalise them and ignore them?
Yes, that is my view. I think that the case was one in which could have been settled out of court.
Yep.
Irving made 2 offers, but the price that Penguin, the publishers, and Deborah Lipstadt would have paid would have been unacceptably high. He wanted a large sum of money for settling out of court, and more importantly, he wanted the book to be withdrawn and pulped, and it would not have been possible to call anybody a Holocaust denier without being sued, and would not have been possible to say Holocaust deniers falsify history. So as a matter of principle, it was very important that the case was actually fought all the way through.
Mm-hmm.
How did it feel being, actually interrogated by him? Because normally there's a lawyer between you and the subject. So how was that?
Yeah, well, as you see in the film, it was agreed in a pre-trial hearing that there would be no jury, because he was flattered by being told that all the issues involved were far too complicated for ordinary people to understand. It was all involved lots of German and so on. And he conducted his own case, partly because he couldn't afford a barrister, I think, but also particularly because he didn't trust a barrister to make the necessary political capital out of the case. For him, this was the oxygen of publicity. He'd been shut out of the media for several years, and the best part of a decade, since he became a hardline Holocaust denier. And he saw his chance to get his views across to the public. So it lent a particular edge, I think, to the proceedings. I made the mistake in the first half day, of looking him in the eye. And as Robert Jan van Pelt had said to me, don't look him in the eye, you'll get annoyed. And I did get annoyed. So I rethought. I was described in one of the press papers as treating him like a rather dim student who could not really understand the arguments that are being put forward. So the rest of my 28 hours in the witness box, it's not just 3 minutes, as you'll see in the film, I didn't look him. I turned my back on him and address my remarks to the judge, which actually you're supposed to do. You are a friend of the court, or it used to be called amicus curiae, except Tony Blair had just banned the use of Latin in courts, much to the real irritation of all the lawyers. So your responsibility is to the judge, and I just addressed my remarks to him. And that got Irving annoyed, and he got rattled and started calling me witness and other rude things. So it did. And the other thing is, I couldn't. There's a little altercation at the beginning of my evidence, and I couldn't. He said, "You say so." I said, "Can you point to me the page in my 740-page report where I say that?" And the judge said, "Oh, come on," And I said, "I'm sorry, my lord, I can't trust him to give an accurate, non-falsified representation of what I wrote in my report." And I couldn't, because I turned to the page and I was saying something completely different to what he claimed. And so that made it more challenging, but in a sense kind of easier, because with every question he asked, I wanted the reference, and then I could show the court that in fact he falsified my report. And there was an extraordinary exchange later on in my evidence where we were discussing Hitler's so-called political testament. And in that, he says, he blames the Jews, because he thinks the Jews are running Britain and America, for the bombing of Germany, resulting in 500,000 civilian deaths. And in Hitler says, for this crime they've committed, the Jews have had to pay with their own lives, but in a more humane way. So I was quoting this because he's referring to the gas chambers. And Irving says, so you think the gas chambers are humane? I said, no, it's Hitler who's saying this. And there were gasps from the court.
Yeah. We are approaching the end of the time we allocated for the discussion. Are there any final questions from Colin or Barbara? A quick one, a light one?
Well, let me just say a couple of things. Film does as I say, give the impression that I and my assistants are out to get Irving, and we were not. It's not quite fair to Robert Jan van Pelt. It does use actors who have very little physical resemblance to the people they're playing, and in particular, John Sessions, who's playing me, definitely should have lost weight before he appeared before the cameras. And it leaves out with the most extraordinary episode in the trial, I think because the screenwriter felt it would be a bit, sort of lower the tone a bit, where in his final statement, and it does show Irving coming in, he's pelted with eggs, and as he comes in his shirt sleeves and so on, makes a statement. But in that statement, he addressed the judge as Mein Führer. He said Mein Führer to the judge. And the court burst out laughing, and the judge, in the end, the judge stopped this. And I was phoned up a couple of days later by a man who's a psychiatrist who's writing about Freudian slips. And he said, did he really say that? I said, well, I couldn't believe my ears, but yes, he did, And he phoned up the judge, who was unusually forthcoming. And the judge had said, well, yes, he did, because he apologized to him amidst the laughter. And the psychiatrist said, well, his explanation was that Irving was born in 1938, and when he was 4, his father had gone away to sea, to fight for Mr. Churchill, as his mother must have said, against Hitler. And he conceived a loathing of Churchill, which has remained with him all his life, and found in Hitler a substitute father figure. You might think you could find a better one, wouldn't you? But because his brother remembers him taking him out in Essex as the German bombers came over and giving a Nazi salute to them as they went on their way to bomb the docks at the age of 4. And so Hitler, for him, was a benign authority figure. And this doesn't come over in the trial, but the judge leant over backwards to help Irving. He'd even tell him what questions to ask me. Yeah. He'd compliment him on his knowledge of the law, which actually was 0, but I mean the judge did not want Irving to have the grounds for appeal that he'd been disadvantaged by being a litigant in person, by not being represented by a professional. And so Irving rather warmed to the judge, and as a benign authority, somehow in the back of his mind confused him with Hitler. So I leave you with that little aperçu, which you won't see in the film. But it's a good film. It's a faithful representation on the whole of the trial and the spirit behind it. And it does get some important messages across, which are well worth thinking about.
Oh, you've made me terribly scared of making an awful Freudian slip at the end, so I won't mention any names. But I'd like to thank you very, very much for sharing your insights with us. And I will now ask Takashi to come and make the transition to the film. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sir Richard, Barbara, Mark, and Colin for a very interesting and informative discussion. I'm sure that what we've just heard help us better appreciate the film we are about to watch. Now, just let me make an announcement here that Sir Richard will deliver the 2017 Michael King Memorial Lecture on War in the Nazi Imagination on Thursday, the 12th of October at 5:30 p.m. And the venue is Burns 1 Lecture Theatre. So I hope you will be able to join us at that lecture as well. And thank you everyone for coming, and I hope you will enjoy the film. And once again, please join me in thanking the